Deliberately based in a lurid version of reality where a knife-wielding maniac gets stab happy at a campground, Friday the 13th is a giant in the horror world, and one of the most lucrative series of the whole damn genre. And while everyone knows that Pamela Voorhees is to thank for her hard and murderous work establishing the franchise, there's plenty more trivia that has gotten buried under another whopping 11 movie outings under the banner since. And as a freebie, just to get this whole thing kicked off, the fear of Friday the 13th is the word that appears on screen right now because I have no hope in hell of pronouncing it. Paraskevidicatriophobia. Try saying that 7 times as fast. I am the hash-slinging slasher, Ash from What Culture, and these are 13 things you didn't know about Friday the 13th. 13. The director gave a horror icon his break. Interestingly, it was Friday the 13th's director and producer Sean S. Cunningham who gave none other than Wes Craven his big break in 1971. Desperate to get into movies and attracted by the success of Cunningham's first feature, the zero-budget sexploitation movie The Art of Marriage, Craven worked as editor and producer on the follow-up, a loose remake called Together. The pair worked so well together that Cunningham produced Craven's written and directorial debut, Last House on the Left, the following year. When Craven took on Scream in 1995, he worried that he might be burned out on horror following the failure of New Nightmare and Vampire in Brooklyn. But working with genre-obsessed screenwriter Kevin Williamson, he got his mojo back in spades, and pays homage to the man that gave him his break with that iconic film trivia question. Number 12. Few of the key players involved made this movie for artistic purposes. Cunningham and writer Victor Miller, in particular, just wanted to keep the lights on at home. Cunningham was sure that Manny's Orphans, his 1978 soccer movie for kids, would be his big breakthrough. And Victor Miller, on the other hand, was convinced that he'd make his break on a comedy. To prove it, he then spent most of his subsequent career writing for daytime soap operas. Uninterested in horror as a genre, Miller openly admits that he hasn't seen any of the Friday the 13th sequels because he hates the idea of Jason Voorhees still being alive, let alone being the killer. It is disheartening at the very least. Neither man is a rousing ambassador for the horror genre or for Jason Voorhees as a horror icon. Yet 40 years on, they're still chasing their big moment in the sun, desperate for another cash-in as they compete for the rights. 11. The film was sold before there was a treatment. Cunningham, working hard on making a fast buck out of family movies, was working on selling the idea for a Friday the 13th movie long before there was anything resembling a script, or even an idea for one. In an interview with SFX, he explained that he sold the title in a full-page Variety ad posted over the 4th of July weekend in 1979. In response, the backers behind his previous exploitation movies, Together and The Last House on the Left, saw it and offered to put up the whole $500,000 production budget. Initially, Cunningham said no, the deal wasn't that great, and he wouldn't make enough money from it. The next day, however, he changed his mind when it was pointed out to him that he had just received financing for a screenplay that did not exist. 10. The film was cast with Broadway kids. The casting was taken care of by TNI, a highly respected agency that had excellent contacts in the Broadway community. Friday the 13th was the first horror film that TNI had worked on, and they went to who they knew, casting young stage and theatre actors who were attracted to the low-rent production based purely on the reputation of the casting agency. Many of those throwing their hats into the ring didn't even know what kind of movie they were auditioning for. The pedigree helped, as the film's premiere ended up being on Broadway at the Low State Theatre, a near 2,000-seat venue. By that point, advance word was so good that the place was sold out, and subsequent showings had lines around the block. 9. Mrs. Voorhees and the Odd Coincidence Part 1. In the film, Betsy Palmer plays Mrs. Voorhees, who'd been the cook for Camp Crystal Lake in 1957. The movie implies that ever since murdering 2 camp counselors the following year for the negligent death of her son, Mrs. Voorhees had been obsessed with Crystal Lake, setting fires and poisoning the water in an effort to keep the camp closed and only coming out to resume the murders once her efforts at sabotage began to fail. In real life, this was all destiny. Along with her father and her brother, Palmer herself had actually spent summers in a place called Crystal Lake as a child. Creepy. 8. Mrs. Voorhees and the Odd Coincidence Part 2. Friday the 13th establishes Jason's drowning as having taken place in 1957, and the resulting murders of the 2 neglectful counsellors a year later in 1958. Now, a title card near the beginning and a local radio broadcast both firmly establish the main action of the original Friday the 13th as taking place on Friday, June 13th. This would position it in 1980, the film the year was released, and this exact date was later corroborated by the trailer to Friday the 13th Part 2. Now, why am I going on about all these numbers? It's because this is exactly 22 years since the original murders. One hell of a comeback. But what many people don't know is Betsy Palmer was on an unofficial comeback of her own. Although she'd never been completely out of work, it had been 22 years since she had last worked on a movie, too. 7. The killer was a man until the very end. In Miller's original script, the killer terrorizing Crystal Lake is referred to as the Prowler for convenience's sake. Betsy Palmer was only there to film for 10 days and was not available to shoot the initial scenes of the movie. She herself acknowledged the man played the killer throughout the rest of the film until Mrs. Voorhees reveals herself at the end. The hands, feet, and trouser legs usually belong to special effects legend Tom Savini's assistant, Tasso Nicholas Stavrakis, now a minor legend in horror as a stunt performer and actor. He's known for playing the most zombies out of anyone in a Romero movie, 5 in Dawn of the Dead and 4 in Day of the Dead, as well as a non-undead role as one of the maniacal Rhodes soldiers. However, Stavrakis refused to come back for Friday the 13th Part 2 because Tom Savini had declined. Get you some friends like that. 6. The poor snake was very, very real. The scene with the snake in Alice Hardy's cabin was not in the script. It came from an idea Tom Savini put forward after he found a snake in his own cabin during the shoot. The idea was to set up a simple jump scare as a genuine potential threat to the protagonist so they could take care of it on their own, proving to the audience that they weren't easy victims like the teenagers in Halloween. Of course, this was a low-budget flick, so a real snake was trapped and placed in the scene by the untrained crew. And yes, horribly, the snake's death is just as real. Cunningham himself wielded the machete that cut the poor thing in half, horrifying Adrienne King and the other cast members who hadn't been told he was going to kill it in front of them. 5. The final fight was a bruising experience. The final fight scene between Betsy Palmer and Adrienne King, which was another night shoot, was a battering and bruising affair. There was no budget for stunt actors, and Cunningham acknowledges that the idea of having stunt performers didn't even really ever occur to him. The two women really went to town on the scene to ensure that it looked as good as it possibly could. As the night wore on, it got colder and colder, but adrenaline kicked in their fight-or-flight reflexes. King admits that Palmer really did pound her head into the sand, and that she'd had to give as good as she got or risk being senseless by the stronger, older woman. The whole sequence had been written out by Cunningham in advance based on a handwritten, numbered list of set pieces he wanted to incorporate. Interestingly enough, the number of points was 13. 4. Jason was never supposed to still be alive. Someone had come up with the idea of having Jason rise from the water to attack Alice for the ending of the movie, but Cunningham initially thought that was ridiculous. He only went with it once Miller wrote it as a dream sequence, as he wanted his film to riff on reality as largely as possible. A dream would provide a reason for Jason still being in the lake and still being 11 years old, without resorting to supernatural theatrics. Cunningham's idea was a deliberate riff on the ending to Brian De Palma's Carrie. De Palma himself had been riffing on Deliverance, which had a hand coming out of the water in a similar manner at the end of the movie. The series of homages came full circle in an iconic fashion, as Deliverance's watery tease is revealed to be a nightmare that survivor John Voight wakes from in a panic. 3. The writer had one major quibble about the finished film. Victor Miller has made it very clear over the last few decades how irritated he was by the Friday the 13th sequels. While he loved the first movie, he had one big issue with the inclusion of a motorcycle cop arriving at the camp halfway through, as it wasn't something he'd written at any point in any of his drafts of the script. It was an uncredited rewrite. Miller's issue was that he wanted Camp Crystal Lake to be completely cut off from the outside world and away from main roads. He believed that this would heighten the audience's apprehension as the murders began, knowing that the young protagonists were too far away to fetch help or to have help come to them. Having a patrolman show up out of nowhere, in his mind, completely deflated what he was aiming for. 2. Mrs. Voorhees and the Odd Coincidence, Part 3. Friday the 13th was released in 1980 and was critically panned as expected. It was cheap and lurid horror, low rent, and unashamedly exploitative, released by filmmakers looking to make a fast buck. Also released in 1980 was the critically acclaimed, Oscar-winning drama Ordinary People, which, oddly enough, had a very similar plot engine to Cunningham and Miller's gory slasher. Based in a rural lakeside location, both movies pivot around the appalling consequences of a young boy's accidental drowning. Both stories have at their centre an obsessive mother unable to cope with her son's loss, who takes it out on those around her. Both narratives position their protagonists as trapped, doomed by choices not of their making. And in early drafts of Alvin Sargent's screenplay for Ordinary People, The dead boy's name was Jason. 1. The film was the victim of a hatchet job. The legendary and legendarily priggish critic Gene Siskel hated horror movies. So no one was surprised that, like the other critics, Siskel intensely disliked Friday the 13th. But even for him, his reaction was extreme. Labeling it a meat cleaver in the forehead movie, he gave it 0 stars, calling Cunningham one of the most despicable creatures ever to infest the movie business. What was unexpected was that Siskel would take it upon himself to reveal to the readers of the Chicago Tribune the twist ending to the film right at the beginning of the review in an attempt to sabotage it completely. Incredibly, he even published the name of the chairman of the board of Paramount Pictures' parent company, Gulf and Western, for readers to complain to. And even worse, he found out in which town in Connecticut Betsy Palmer made her home and suggested that his readers write hate mail to her as well. Fortunately, he was misinformed, and Palmer never received a thing. What an ass! And that's our list. Any other Friday the 13th trivia that should be up here? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. I've been Ash and this has been What Culture. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and stop having sex in the woods if you don't want to get murdered. Thanks for watching.